Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome Jeff Donaldson, who will be introducing our speaker tonight. Jeff is an alumni of our Executive MBA program and managing partner of Atomic 20 Marketing.
So when I graduated my undergrad here at Daniels, and I starting my career 22 years old, I had this gut feeling that I wanted to find something that was high energy, very invigorating. 22-year-old, I had tons of energy, and I couldn't really find something that fit for me, either a company or an industry. And I found a lot of solid jobs, but they just didn't seem to fit what I was looking for or my skills. And I finally ended up in the advertising industry, in the beer industry nonetheless. So clearly, being able to work on brands like Coors Light, Blue Moon, Coors Banquet, and being able to work on projects with the NFL, like for Super Bowl, or the Coors Light Twins. How many of you remember them? The Coors Light Twins? Oh, even an applause. After about 10 years of that, though, I realized that having a job that was fast-paced and energetic wasn't cutting it for this feeling that I had, that I was still searching for that perfect job and perfect career. And I stumbled on this thing called the Executive MBA program here at DU. And I had no intention of going back to school, especially in my 30s. But I soon realized that I didn't know what I didn't know. And the fact that I couldn't figure out how I could find something that I wanted to do if I didn't know those things. So I joined the EMBA program and quickly started to get perspectives on things literally around the world that started to show me what was possible. And I came to realize that feeling that I had been trying to find that perfect position and industry and job was entrepreneurship, where I was able to still get the fast-paced and energetic position, but as an entrepreneur, I also got the ability to work in an industry that was very agile, a lot more creative thinking, being able to take advantage of opportunities. And so the companies that I worked at started to get smaller and smaller. I started searching for that entrepreneurial spirit, starting at Coors, then Crocs, then a handful of startups, and then finally starting my own marketing agency. And what's interesting is that the agency that we started about 4 years ago is based on an idea that creative talent in the U.S. is going to waste. And the reason for that is because 1/3 of our workforce has done something similar to what I've done, which has gone independent, left the corporate world, and gone and done their own thing. But what's interesting is that has somewhat forced a lot of that workforce to be isolated in coffee shops, home offices, and if you get lucky, you find a group of people you can work with. So an idea that in a place like we live in the United States and in Colorado, building a business of my own based on a trend like that, which swarms together all those independents to work on projects together to have really big results. And that's what we've seen over the last 4 years. We've been able to work with some incredible brands all the way to creating a brand for the state of Colorado. And what I've really found is that the entrepreneurship to me has allowed me to not only work on the projects that I choose, but also it gives me the opportunity to see the impact pretty immediately on my efforts, and also to be able to take a risk when I see an opportunity. And that was something that I wasn't able to do at the larger companies. A lot of people think that being an entrepreneur is risky. It definitely is. But I see the risk as opportunity and excitement. And what I've started to see also is that there are a lot of people that agree. There are 600,000 companies started every month. 600,000 every single month in the U.S. And we happen to all live in a state that is ranked number 2 in the country for entrepreneurship. And we also happen to have a city in Colorado that is ranked number 1 in startups, above Silicon Valley and anywhere else. Happens to be where the headquarters of Zayo Group is located in Boulder. But that showed me that there's something happening And successful entrepreneurs here and everywhere have really honed their skills on leadership, marketing, management, being able to pick the people and put them around them that can help really bring their ideas to life. And our speaker tonight has those skills and then some. He's been able to build on his successes, has really been able to open doors and create opportunities. And you've all probably seen his resume of accomplishments. Before turning Zayo Group into a multi-billion-dollar company, he honed his skills at Level 3 Communications as one of the founding executives. Before that, he had been in the communications industry for quite a while and was really taking ICG Communications to another level with a successful buyout from Level 3. And he's been rewarded for these successes as well, being named the Lifetime Achievement Award and Communications Executive of the Year in Colorado, numerous recognitions for Entrepreneur of the Year from Ernst & Young, and the list goes on. But what you probably don't know about him, and you won't read in the press, is that he's an entrepreneur that has figured out a way to find balance. And his balance has come from many areas, but his love of family, connecting with people around him, he's really been able to have the success and the achievements and also find balance at the same time. One of his achievements that really hasn't been publicized is the fact that he beat cancer this summer and really put things in perspective for him. Hasn't slowed him down at all, but it has at least given him that opportunity to really try and find balance and success at the same time. So please join me in welcoming the CEO of Zayo Group, Dan Caruso.
Right was turning on the volume. So thank you, Daniel's School of Business. Dean Patty, appreciate you having Zayo up here and telling a little bit about our story. It's really nice being up here at the Daniel School of Business. You know, my name's Daniel. So I think it was a little much renaming your business school after me, Daniel's School of Business, but I do appreciate it. It's a very nice touch. So I'm going to tell you a story about a history of an industry that traverses 120 years. So get very comfortable. We're going to go through a 120-year story, and it started with a single company called AT&T. Once upon a time, there was only AT&T. If you wanted phone service, you got it from AT&T. You might have thought of Mountain Bell or Illinois Bell. They all were part of AT&T. It was one company. The good news about my 120-year story is for 90 years, there was just AT&T. So we get to fast forward to 90 years later. By 1980, competition began. It started out with long-distance competition, and it started out with upstarts who decided that there should be more choice in where you get your phone service. There was a company called MCI, which is a name that probably doesn't resonate to a lot of folks in this room. It was called Microwave Communication Networks. They actually started by putting up microwave systems and giving companies an opportunity to connect up between cities off of AT&T. It wasn't clear whether or not that was legal, so they ended up with more lawyers working for the company than they did any other type of profession, and it took them years to break through the monopoly that was AT&T. Another early upstart was Sprint, a name that is still recognizable to this name, and they've had quite the history as well. So this long story that I'm going to tell you about also involves a story of how I got to this stage here. And that's a story that began when I decided to go to University of Illinois to get my education. And at that point, I decided to go into engineering Not because I knew what engineers did. I really, frankly, wasn't sure what engineers did for a living. But I did know that they made more money coming out of undergrad than any other profession. So I slugged my way through an engineering program. I don't know if that's the most noble reason to choose a degree, but it frankly was the reason why I went into engineering. I was good at math, but it really was thinking that that was a good way to go. And so while I was at school, that's when long-distance competition really started to spring up. And it started to get on the radar screen of even students in those days because you got to choose for the first time who you wanted your long-distance carrier to be. Okay? I decided to join the telecommunication industry. I went and joined one of the baby bells. So what happened at that point is they broke apart AT&T. So the challenges that began with Sprint and MCI and others resulted in them declaring AT&T to be a monopoly and broke it apart. And when they broke it apart, they formed multiple different companies, one of which was called Ameritech, and Ameritech housed 5 of the Bell companies, including Illinois Bell. So when I came out of undergrad, I decided to join up with that. And why did I do that? Actually, I had some pretty good reasons this time around. I heard a little bit about this new technology called fiber optics and how it was going to transform communications. Data, and specifically, it was known as ISDN at the time, but data networking was just beginning. You know, we take that for granted today, but back then, people used communication networks to talk on a phone. They didn't use them for data, but that was beginning to change, and that was clearly on the horizon. And then there was this regulatory shakeup that was going to change the entire industry. So what I was able to kind of deduce is that where there is a lot of change, there's a lot of opportunity. And then there was one other reason why I joined this particular job in the Bell system, and it's because it offered a management rotation program. It offered to take students, put them together in a class, and they would have us spend the summer where we basically travel around different jobs in the company. We'd spend 3 days with outside plant construction folks, watching them or sort of helping them. Maybe all they let us do is get their coffee, but as they did the construction work, we got to hang out with them. We get to spend time with the network planners, with the finance folks. We'd sit in classrooms and learn about fiber optics and ISDN. So we spent the first 2.5 months in this engaged, half classroom, half being immersed in jobs. And then it became a rotational program where they moved us into different jobs every 9 months while we learned the business. The reason I emphasize that is because Zayo, the company I'm with now, we put a program of that type in place, and I think there's probably multiple people in the crowd here. Raise your hands if you're part of that program. Some were very early members, some more recent, but we have a rotational program that we put in place over the last 4 years that's attracted a lot of DU and CU students and others, and is giving them the opportunity to learn across the business. So anyways, I joined up with the Bell system because of seeing this opportunity for a quick learning experience in an industry that was undergoing fundamental change and frankly touched everyone's lives. Illinois Bell and Ameritech was nice enough to pay for my MBA, so while working there, I went at night and got my MBA at University of Chicago, realizing that if you have an MBA combined with a technical degree, that was a pretty good formula back then, and it's just as good a formula today. So I went to University of Chicago, and while I was there, local competition began to emerge in earnest. So originally, when MCI and Sprint were competing with AT&T, it was all about long distance. But then there were these new companies who started to put fiber optics in local networks. And there was one company called Chicago Fiber Optics that was arguably the first one to do it. They used the underground rail tunnels underneath the city of Chicago, put fiber in there and connected up to the trading exchanges and offered kind of a direct connection between where the financial traders were to Sprint and MCI and others so they could completely bypass Illinois Bell. So that began happening in different parts of the U.S., Chicago being certainly right there in the forefront of it. And I was still in Ameritech, but hearing about this and seeing it and realizing that the nature of my personality is not one that should be spent trying to defend a monopoly from competition, but instead better off being part of the competition that's attacking the monopoly. I also figured I better wait till I get my MBA paid for before I did that, so it took me a couple years extra to get myself over there. So I joined this MFS Communications, and MFS became the probably most aggressive, most proactive competitor to the Bell system. We began rolling out networks all over the United States. That was my job, was to take certain regions of the U.S. and lead us into building networks. And then I led the charge to bring competition to switch networks, which I won't get into details what that means, but it was a new kind of competition that began in the early 1990s. But then something else happened. We started to realize that we were selling a lot of service, these direct connections, these data connections, and these companies were buying it up, but we didn't know who these companies were. Our salespeople were claiming it's because they were such great salespeople, and they were pretty good, but they were selling the companies these connections, one after another after another, and they were growing and growing and growing. Turned out it was the internet. Now, I've got bright lights in me, so I can't see the full audience here. I know I only look like I'm 35 or 36, but I'm actually 50 years old. Who here is right around 50 years old? You don't have to raise your hand if you don't want to. Think about when you first sensed the internet. Because when we grew up, there wasn't an internet. There wasn't anything that was even a clear precursor to the internet. It almost kind of popped out of nowhere. We started to use this AOL dial-up service, but we didn't really think of that or know that to be the internet. It was just to download. I don't even know what we used it for. Email, which was a very new phenomenon in those days. But all of a sudden, you started to hear the word internet, and it was all around 1994-ish time frame. And I actually have a distinct memory. Jim Crow, who still lives in this area, was the founder of both MFS and then Level 3. He actually brought us into a room, a classroom setting, about 30 of the senior-most people at the time at MFS. And he sat us down, and he got in front of the room. He had a screen up, and he had a projector against the screen. Now, we do that every day in the working world today, but back then, people didn't do that. People didn't project stuff up against screens very often, and if they did, it certainly wasn't the CEO of the company typing away at a computer, bringing stuff on a screen. And what he took us through is things like, okay, this is what a web browser is. This is Netscape. This is, I can't remember the name of the applications back then. And he took us through 3 or 4 or 5 of them, and then he paused. And we're all looking at each other like, what is going on here? I mean, why is he doing this? He said, the internet's going to change everything. It's going to change everything. It's going to change everything in our work environment, but it's going to change everything in all work environments. He goes, and I'm going to give you guys a choice. And here's your choice. Choice number 1 is that you embrace the internet. Choice number 2 is you're like, oh, you know what? That's for the younger crowd. I'm at the tail of my career. I made plenty of money. That's just not for me. So it's your choice. If you choose the former, if you choose to embrace it, you might have a good career here. No guarantees, but you might have a good career here. If you choose the latter, I'd just soon you leave right now. So make your choice, but choose whether to stay or go. If you choose to stay, make sure you're prepared to embrace the internet. And turned out he was pretty right. So I went through this period of time of trying to understand what the internet was, but then I was fortunate enough to have an advantage because shortly after that event, Jim started to scour out there and say, okay, if we're going to really embrace the internet, what do we need to do? And he came across this company called UUNet, which is on the bottom right corner here. There was about 3 or 4 internet backbones in those days that came out of the university and research environment, and then they became companies that were private companies. He actually led a buyout of this company, UUNet, which people thought was crazy, not as crazy as What's Up that just got acquired last week, but pretty crazy nonetheless. So we acquired it, and I had the good fortune at the time to work for a guy by the name of John Sidgmore, who was one of the kind of leaders of internet backbone at the time. And he kind of like the Daniels name of your business school. He had this project that was called Project Dan for Dial Access Network. And that project pre-existed kind of me meeting them, but then they assigned Project Dan to me and my team to implement. And before too long, people thought it was named Project Dan because I had a big ego. Now, I did have a big ego, but that wasn't why it was named Project Dan. So we acquired UNet, which was the leading backbone. It carried most of AOL's traffic, and we got to learn firsthand what the internet was all about. But that didn't last very long. What happened shortly thereafter, frankly within months, let's see, I might be slightly ahead of my story. Yeah, so what started to happen is new companies started to emerge in earnest. And one of those new companies was called WorldCom. I think probably everyone in this room is aware of WorldCom. Well, WorldCom ended up acquiring multiple companies, one of which was MFS, and they acquired MFS within months after we acquired UNet. So just as we were starting to onboard UNet, we became part of this WorldCom machine. And WorldCom was headed up by a guy by the name of Bernie Evers and his CFO, Scott Sullivan. And I got to know them. You know, we acquired, I was one of the unlucky executives of MFS that WorldCom decided they wanted to keep. Everyone else they sent home, but when they sent you home, you got all your options accelerated and got to do your next thing. I had to stay and either leave my invested options behind or be part of this WorldCom team. Because most of the senior people left, I all of a sudden was one of the most senior people that were from MFS and one of the few who really understood how the business of the network really worked. And that gave me direct exposure to Scott and Bernie, and frankly, to what they were doing from an accounting standpoint, from how they were manipulating the accounting information to show the appearance of value being created when the business was actually not doing well at all. So fortunately, in one of kind of what I consider one of the most important moments in my career, I decided to leave. And I had to leave unvested stock options behind, and I actually sold all of my WorldCom stock the way I left, and I remember saying, this is a house of cards that's going to be coming down, and I just don't want to be here when it does. Now, when I left and sold my stock, it immediately doubled in value. So didn't feel very good for a few months, but then it went to zero, so I felt much better after that. So WorldCom acquires MFS. I decide I don't like WorldCom, move on, and decide to become part of the founding team of Level 3. So Level 3, we actually started where a handful of us were in Chicago and a handful were in Omaha. It was the MFS Mafia, certain members of the MFS team that got back together. I think my claim to fame was I was the first one who actually had a job that I had to leave. Everyone else was on the sidelines golfing or fishing or whatever they do in Omaha. And we decided to get back together and form a company. And fortunately, because this company, Kiewit, made so much money on MFS, they decided that they were going to fund it with $2.5 billion, even though we didn't have a business plan. So we were a startup with $2.5 billion, with Jim Crow having the notion that we were going to do something relative to the internet. He just wasn't sure what. You know, he had certain notions he would talk about, and there's some stories from those years. I remember one in particular where I was tossing and turning one night because Jim kept talking about how SS7, which is a signaling network used to run telephone networks, how SS7 was going to have to somehow get integrated with the IP networks, Internet Protocol, kind of the technology behind the internet, how those two were going to need to come together. And he'd talk about it all the time, and we were supposed to be building a business around it. So we're maybe a month or month and a half into it, and I was supposedly out of the team, the one that was the most expert in that area, but I didn't have the faintest clue what he was talking about. So I, was trying to get books, trying to read up, what is SS7, how does it really work, this and that. So I remember coming in the office one Monday after tossing and turning this weekend, going to other members of the team. And I started with one other guy who still lives in this area, and said, hey, do you know what Jim's talking about with this SS7 IP? He's like, I don't have the faintest idea. I thought you did. So I went to another guy, same thing. Then finally I went to Kevin O'Hara, who's the COO. I said, Kevin, like, what is he talking about? He's like, you don't know? I'm like, no. He's like, well, I don't know. You're the one who's supposed to know this stuff. Go figure it out. So I went off and I came up with all these charts. In fact, for the Zayo crowd, you can see one of those in my office today if you see this cryptic map sitting on my shelf, and actually put this stuff together that was how, in my mind, this whole thing was supposed to work. Took it down to Omaha. Jim was still in Omaha at the time. Took it down there to share it with him, and he just chuckled and laughed it off, saying, are you kidding me? Good try. Keep working on it. But then a day or two later, he called me up and said, I was thinking a little bit more about that. I think that's exactly what we need to do. And that became kind of the precursor. We then hired people who really knew what they were doing, but that became the precursor of what we call soft switch networks today. But in any case, we had this idea behind Level 3, building a bunch of fiber in between cities, flooding it through, and it sounded like a great idea. We were enthusiastically received. We all moved out here to the Interlochen area just outside of Boulder, and we were all excited, and things went great for a good while there. But it didn't last all that long. It seemed like forever, but what happened is so much money flowed into the industry. I'm not sure if investors were less responsible than management or if management was less responsible than investors, but it was a case of a massive boom, a gold rush, where people couldn't spend money fast enough. They couldn't raise it fast enough. They couldn't spend it fast enough. How much fiber can you build? So there's really two things going on in parallel. One was the building of fiber networks all over the place, and the second was the dot-com. These dot-com concepts that were getting launched and using Super Bowl to advertise themselves, and both of these were just getting so much attention. We went public. At one point, our stock rose to, at Level 3, to, I think it was peaked at about $120, $130 a share. By today's standards, I think that's only about $2 a share. So years later, Level 3, which fared well in this, is the equivalent of, about maybe 2/100ths of its stock price. I might be $4 a share, but it's a small number. They since did a reverse split, so the price is higher than that. But we lived through this period where tons of companies got funded. There was this overexuberance, and it just came crashing down. Massive corrections, companies exploding left and right, one after another. And in the meantime, some familiar names started to rise back up. You had AT&T, you had Verizon, who had their old revenue base to sustain themselves, even though they made some extraordinarily severe mistakes during this era as well. They were able to also grow in the process, pick up some of the pieces, as did others. In the meantime, Level 3 stopped liking me. So, and depending on whose version of the story you believe, and they're all probably right and they're all probably wrong, I ended up leaving Level 3 in about the year 2002. It wasn't a graceful exit. They sort of kicked me out. By the way, I never explained the bear. My nickname was and still is the bear, so that's why you see this guy floating around with a bear. So I left there, and this was during the height of, it wasn't really the height of the meltdown, because the height of the meltdown was really 2000, 2001, and we actually got Level 3 on pretty solid ground, so I didn't leave till about 2003, maybe 2004 timeframe. So Level 3 was on solid ground at that point in time, but the industry was still suffering from kind of, what are we going to do now? A lot of the bankruptcies had occurred. A lot of the companies either went away or were combined into other companies. Well, one company that's right down the street from here is called ICG Communications. It's the company, for those who don't know, in a black building that kind of leans over on I-25. It went through one of the earliest bankruptcies of the telecom meltdown. It came out of the bankruptcy without really changing its business very much. It changed its balance sheet by reclassifying debt to equity and doing various types of workouts. But they thought that the fundamental of the business was fine, only to find out over the next 2 years that there was something fundamentally wrong with the business itself. So they started to go back into a tailspin, and were about ready to crash back into a bankruptcy situation. So that's when I worked with some private equity investors and bought the equity of the company, the public equity, and took it private. Through some good luck and some good fortune, we timed ourselves just right. We were able to buy the company by only spending about $9 million, but we were able to exit the company 2 years later for all-in proceeds of about $225 million. So we had a 25 times return, including the management's portion of that. And what we did is we basically got very focused on, it's no longer about storylines, it's no longer about hype, it's no longer about trying to convince people that you've got this great business that's going to be fantastic because the internet's going to grow and grow, but instead it's really about how are you making money, not just today and tomorrow, but for the next 3, 5, 10 years. What is, back to the fundamentals of business, what really is your competitive strength, what really is your business model, what can sustain itself. So we shed a lot of activities that frankly were just maybe helping the revenue line, but they were costing the company a ton of money. We focused on where we had fiber networks, honed in on that, and did a real good job for the customers in those areas where we had a fiber-rich platform. So we started to turn the company into a revenue growth company and one that was profitable, and we sold off some of the weaker kind of geographies and then sold off the biggest piece to Level 3 about 2 years later, knowing that the company was subscale. So while we're doing that, consolidation is continuing throughout the industry. Companies are being acquired. ICG was part of an acquisition spree that Level 3 went on. CenturyLink and US West, CenturyLink and Quest merged. Just all types of acquisitions going on. And during this time, and noteworthy, bad guys were punished. And at least one of the stories is very local here in Colorado. There's the WorldCom story I told you about. Both these guys, I believe, are still in jail today. Joe Nascio of Quest, who I think is still in jail today. Dennis Kozlowski of Tyco. Now, Tyco was a lot of things, but they also had a Tyco submarine cable business, a fiber business, that was part of what was causing disarray there. Enron's an energy company, but they had a broadband fiber business that was a big part of what unraveled there. Lessons that, and I knew just about every one of these folks, either met them a handful of times or was 1 or 2 steps removed from them, and many others. So it was a very firsthand opportunity for me to learn what the difference is between kind of running a company where you're trying to manage for a stock price to look good at a certain point of time so that people can make a lot of money and get out, even if they have to bend a lot of rules, versus what it means to really build a sustainable company. So it was very good lessons to learn. So now we're in the year 2006, 2007, we sold ICG and we started observing that the industry is changing. So this industry that was a big boom in the late 90s, early 2000s, a big bust and meltdown of the early 2000s, something's different. And it starts by all this consolidation, that the number of suppliers of bandwidth, the supply of bandwidth is shrinking, and at the same time, bandwidth, the need for bandwidth is continuing to grow. Okay, so we weren't wrong about the internet. When we all thought the internet was going to be a great idea and was going to change everything back in the late 90s, we were right. It just was an over-exuberance where we got way ahead of ourselves. But the long-term trend was still there. In fact, this is one of my favorite charts because on the left here, that's the total amount of bandwidth during the big fiber boom of the late 90s. You can't even see this on the chart. There's little black bars there that are doubling every 6 to 12 months. During the meltdown, the problem wasn't bandwidth not growing. The internet was continuing to grow. Bandwidth was continuing to grow at a very nice clip. That's the yellow there. It's starting to show up. You can see it on the chart. But now look at it by today's chart. This is how bandwidth has grown since then, and we're toward the tail end of this orange right now. Bandwidth, if you just focus on the increase in bars and how much each increase year over year is relative to the entire size of the internet during the late 90s, early 2000s. So there's this need for bandwidth that's dramatic, including on mobile devices, which is growing more like, 60, 70% every year. So we were observing that the demand for bandwidth is still there, the number of people with fiber was shrinking. Bandwidth applications are boosting cloud computing, video, mobile devices, the whole gamut of how we use social networks and the internet today. And then we observed that there were these fiber companies that somehow navigated their way through the meltdown. And they were getting themselves on solid ground, but no one was paying attention. It was like a tequila hangover. You drink way too much tequila, what happens? You don't want to ever touch tequila again. Well, investors, private equity investors, bankers, they didn't want to waste their time. If they brought up a fiber-based company in the year 2007 to their partners, they would say, were you asleep at the wheel 5 years ago? Do you realize how much money we lost? So institutional money was not paying attention to fiber-based providers. So we saw that as an opportunity. We saw these forgotten fiber orphans out there, and because we had the credibility of having made a bunch of money for private equity investors, we were able to raise a lot of money without really having much of a business plan at all. We just said we want to start acquiring these fiber-based companies and doing a roll-up. And we coined the expression bandwidth infrastructure, that we were going to be a bandwidth infrastructure company. We didn't want to be a telecom company. We didn't want to focus on value-added services. We wanted to really provide infrastructure, dark fiber, lit bandwidth infrastructure to support this rapid growth of the internet. And that's what we did. We started acquiring a bunch of companies. We acquired about 30 companies to date. In the meantime, more consolidation continued to occur. Level 3 bought Global Crossing and others got bigger. CenturyLink bought Quest and got bigger. TW Telecom bought a couple companies, got bigger. And Zayo began to form. And about a year and a half ago, we were able to get this deal done with this company called AboveNet, which was about the same size as us from a revenue and EBITDA standpoint. They were a little bigger in revenue, and we were a little bigger in EBITDA. So when we combined with them, we actually became the largest pure-play provider of bandwidth infrastructure in the U.S., and about similar size right now to TW Telecom. I think they're bigger in revenue, but I think we're a little bit bigger in EBITDA. Slightly different business model, but interesting nonetheless. So just a brief history. We were formed in 2006 on Pearl Street in Boulder, for those of you who are familiar with it, a small office behind Nick and Willie's Pizza. And we proceeded to do a whole bunch of acquisitions of infrastructure companies, fiber and technical space companies. We raised money in the form of both equity and debt through various different investors. We have about 15 private equity investors today, and we're able to raise debt through the big financial crisis of 2008, 2009. That's where a lot of our most critical debt came from. So we had a real strong following from the bank debt community, even when they were under massive distress. Leading to kind of our largest private equity investor today is a company called GTCR out of Chicago. As I mentioned, we are a bandwidth infrastructure company, so we were trying to carve out a niche for ourselves. And the kind of companies we serve are the household names who consume a lot of bandwidth. We have a ton of fiber throughout the U.S. and into Europe. We're more known for our metro fiber networks. The next few slides just give blue lines. That means where we have a lot of deep, extensive fiber, which I will flip through pretty quick. But it's pretty much every major market in the U.S. and quite a few of secondary, tertiary, even very remote markets we feed with these fiber networks. We're about $1.1 billion in revenue, approaching $700 million of EBITDA, cash flow positive with very strong EBITDA margin. And we're hiring. So we have offices in Boulder and in Denver area, perhaps soon to be Denver proper. We're building a bunch of network in Colorado, by the way. We're investing about $30 million in the Front Range building network as far down south as Colorado Springs and all the way through the tech center in Denver itself and into the Boulder and surrounding areas up to Fort Collins and Greeley, a lot of which is being built for the wireless carriers. We pride ourselves on being a very entrepreneurial organization. a lot of people equate the word entrepreneur with startup. We believe that we're kind of like companies who started up as smaller startup entrepreneurial companies but need to maintain that entrepreneurial spirit. When I think of what Amazon or Apple or Google have to deal with, they can't become old companies, traditional companies. They have to stay entrepreneurial. We have to stay entrepreneurial too. So we do things like hackathons, and we leverage Salesforce Chatter as kind of a social media platform for within the company to share information. We actually are sponsoring a software engineering course based on Salesforce.com technology that we're doing late afternoon into the evenings that our employees participate in. We do a lot of lunch and learns and executive roundtables. And we stay very involved with the entrepreneurial community. I personally am on several entrepreneurial boards, including Startup Colorado, and I even co-teach a class at CU called Entrepreneurship and the Private Equity Process. So we try to keep that plug into the entrepreneurial community so that we stay on our edge. Working at Zayo, I know this is Denver, but a lot of our culture is defined around Boulder, although increasingly it's around the entrepreneurial community and in the greater Colorado area as well, especially Denver. So we actually are located in what I think is a very entrepreneurial setting, right in 29th Street Mall, which gives us access to the type of energy that I think keeps us healthy. We think Boulder is an entrepreneurial place, and that's why we like being in Boulder proper. It's getting a lot of recognition for its entrepreneurial skills. And interestingly, through Startup Colorado is part of Startup America, but the Colorado branch has actually gotten more traction than most others. And Startup Colorado actually has 4 branches that work in unison: a Boulder branch, a Denver branch, Fort Collins, and Colorado Springs. So we all get together and we sponsor and collaborate on activities that really spread and the message of entrepreneurism up and down the state in collaboration with the university system. And the other things we like about Boulder is it just is known as a fit, active city, and we try to bring that spirit into the company as well. One other point I want to make before I open this up to some questions is people in Colorado tend to not realize how important the Front Range is to the bandwidth industry. It really is the hub of the bandwidth industry throughout the United States, with the biggest companies who own these fiber networks being Level 3, Zayo, and TW Telecom, all headquartered in the Front Range. There's no other. You have AT&T and Verizon, kind of more traditional telephone companies, obviously headquartered elsewhere. But when it comes to competitive companies who have fiber, all of them are right here. They're right in our radius. And that then gets complemented by other companies. Predating us is the cable TV and satellite industry that has its heritage here in Colorado, and that's what really led to this becoming the hotspot for competitive fiber as well. But then we have increasingly colo and hosting companies where this is a very strong market. You have companies like CoreSite and ViaWest and Cologix and others, hosting.com right up the street, that are here headquartered right here in Colorado. So I try to emphasize the message to the community and to the university system how special of an opportunity that is for us to create jobs and prosper because of our very unique role in this market. So with that, I'm going to open up for some questions or comments and or stories that people want to share about their own experiences during the advent of the internet, the .com, the meltdown itself.
Hello. I was a longtime U.S. West Quest employee, so I saw a lot of the same things you did from a different perspective. But my question is, what do you think of net neutrality, and who do you think is going to win that battle?
Oh, you're going to put me on the spot right away. Well, I think, I'm a little biased on this one, and I know who's going to win that battle. And I'm going to declare right here in front of all of you. That battle is going to be won by those who are the intermediaries, by those who have the fiber networks and carry the bandwidth between both sides of that battle. Companies like Zayo. Which is partially true because that's just what needs to happen because of net neutrality is content needs to be moved around and more companies need to control their own network. While they look to control their own network and send around their own bandwidth, they need infrastructure, fiber, technical space infrastructure, which is what we provide. You know, I don't really have a real strong opinion on that. I do think there's a healthiness to letting the market sort it out. And I don't want that to sound like you can take it to the extreme, but if the cable companies, for example, are put in a position where they have to very reluctantly carry traffic for their competitors, that regulatory overhang could last for years and years and years and years, and it'll never be settled. As long as it's a artificial force that is forcing a relationship upon, it could just persist in a negative way. And I say that with firsthand knowledge because when they broke up the Bell system, there are all these rules about what the Bell companies had to do to enable competition. And they would do the minimal necessary to buy themselves time and what they thought they could get away with, but they would never embrace those. And that, in part, is what led to the destruction of a lot of the CLEC business models. So I think there's a certain healthiness about letting the market sort it out, which I think is somewhat consistent with what the latest rules have been.
Dan, right here.
Good evening. Thanks very much. Great story. And my question goes back in time a little bit. I got introduced into the whole telecom thing in '98 with voice over IP, and I experienced a very, very bumpy ride. But along the way, learned about level 3, and I was just curious, do in some ways you see Zayo, what it is today, having executed what Jim Crow's vision of level 3 was some decade ago?
To some degree, well, the first thing I would say on that is Zayo's on a road, on a journey that we have not yet completed yet. So one thing I've learned about the experiences of both MFS and Level 3 and the industry in total is you can't be too early to feel like you've achieved success. And I think we've done a really good job as Zayo, but I think we still have most of our work in front of us to really see what we can do in executing this business model that we call bandwidth infrastructure. But in some ways, yeah. I mean, I was one of the handful of people there at Level 3 that was trying to conceive of what we were going to be, and the original Zayo was really built around the bandwidth theme, not the soft switch, voice over IP theme. Those kind of sort of coexisted, but in some ways, I think if Level 3 would have hunkered down during the big meltdown phase, which would have been hard to do, but really hunkered down and let that play out, as opposed to try to be more on the offense and try to fight their way through that, they might be in a little bit of a different spot right now. But when they did that, they ended up being more of a full-service telecom company in most or all aspects of telecom, as opposed to being laser-focused on bandwidth and infrastructure like Zayo is today. So perhaps we went down that path because we felt like we had to. We felt like we didn't have a choice. But with the big benefit of hindsight, maybe if we would have stayed at Level 3, more focused on bandwidth, knowing that there's going to be a few tough years, it might have, it might look like a different business than it is today. And who knows, Zayo might not have existed if that would have happened.
Dan, up here on the second level.
Good evening. We've seen a big shift in technology where big companies were the network infrastructure users to now we've got a lot of consumer-driven bandwidth needs. How do you see that impacting the future of the market space?
The future of?
The market space from a network perspective.
I mean, it's a very powerful change. I mean, it's the amount of power that's being put in the hands of consumers. Now, one interesting trend that we see, and I forget the word for consumerization of the internet, perhaps, but where when you're in a business or commercial environment, making your applications behave the same way as if you're a consumer using the internet. I mean, when we get on the internet and you go to Amazon.com, you go to Netflix, you don't have to go and get trained on how to use it. You can pretty much figure out how it works and then unleash a bunch of power at your fingertips. And I think the business environment needs to feel the same way. It shouldn't feel like when you're in business you're using systems that require training and kind of a more static kind of environment. It should feel like the consumerization itself. But yeah, I think as applications are finding their way, powerful applications in the hands of individuals, I mean, it's changing the fabric of society without a doubt. And that's only going to accelerate. It's not going to slow down.
So, Dan, Google is building lots of local networks, and you see John Malone out buying lots of cable companies. Do you view those things as opportunities for Zayo, threats? How do you see all that unfolding?
That's, by the way, that's Steve Halstead, who is rightfully regarded as the father of venture capital here in the Front Range through Centennial Ventures, and I'm proud to say that he's was one of the very early investors in Zayo. So, Steve, thanks for coming. I tend to see those as opportunities. I tend to see that as Google, for example, is announcing intentions to build a lot more deep fiber networks, that's an opportunity for us to work with them and put our fiber to use with yet another company who's implementing another business plan that creates huge demand for bandwidth and, more directly for us, a demand for the fiber that we have in the ground. The Comcast one could be a little bit more tricky, cable TV one, because they control a lot of the end-to-end network themselves. They're in some ways more like a Verizon and AT&T, but at the same time, their rivalry is with an AT&T and a Verizon or a Sprint or a DirecTV. And so from a Zayo perspective, we view ourselves as kind of in a nice kind of neutral ground in between those, and yet that's another opportunity to put our fiber and our resources to work. So unclear how all those play out over time, but for our business to be successful, we have to look at those as opportunities and ask ourselves, how can we support those companies? Not, geez, we feel threatened by them, what are we going to do?
Up here in the second level.
Hey, Dan, good evening. A quick question here about young entrepreneurs that are thinking about starting their own businesses. What single advice will you be able to share with us tonight about one thing that you learned and how other people here might be able to go forward with that? Thank you.
Well, when you're starting your own businesses, so the first thing, starting up a business, a lot of people view as something that's very hard. Starting a business is not hard. People start a business all the time. Having a successful startup is very hard. And the biggest thing you have to face when you're starting up a business is the probability that it's not going to go according to plan. It's going to be a struggle more times than not, much more times than not. You're going to have failure. Most really good ideas sound like really bad ideas to other people. So usually when you're explaining kind of your thought, your idea, most of the people you share it with are going to nod their head and say, yeah, I'll get back to you, and not really resonate. Unless you've been there, done that, established a track record, you're kind of fighting uphill. And frankly, if everyone thinks your idea is a really good idea, it probably isn't, because if it resonates with everyone, it's probably been thought of a couple dozen times before. You just haven't discovered kind of who's all around you. So it's kind of lonely. You have to deal with rejection, with failure, with challenges. You have to have enormous tenacity, and you have to have people around you that you can find who want to work with you and around you to help create something special. So I guess the biggest piece of advice is, know it's a hard road, but you know what? The journey of being part of a startup is what people should really be seeking. Even if it doesn't work at the end of the day, you learn so much. It prepares you for whatever you do after that. Even if being part of a successful startup isn't in the cards for you, the experience of trying to get one to work is a damn good experience to have.
Hi there, Dan. My name's Keith. I'm a second-year grad student over at DU. I'm looking at the strategy, the decisions you've made around expanding through acquisitions. Obviously been successful. Do you consider it sustainable? And have you started to see movement from larger players in reaction to Zayo's success?
Great. The fear of it not being sustainable is something that is always on my mind and often in my behavior for the Zayo folks that are here. Knowing that, I've seen and been part of environments where things seem to be going real well, and you start to let ego and overconfidence kind of get in the way, so you assume it's going to last forever. So I think one benefit that we have is that we've failed in pretty big ways as an industry and as individuals who were part of many of those logos you saw earlier, and it's kept us to the point where we keep reminding ourselves that if we don't have a sustainable, cash flow generating business model that can be fueled for years and years based on the organic performance of the business, if we don't really have that, we're just pretending that we have a business. So for anyone who's been part of Zayo, either directly or from the outside looking in, you'll see that we're very focused on financials, on operational financial metrics, and we publish them externally with a lot of detail, very clearly showing how the trends of our business work financially. In fact, we get criticized at times for providing too much financial information externally, but it reminds us all the time, it helps us understand what's really happening financially, and I even view it as a form of crowdsourcing, because by exposing this information to the wider audience, to investors of Zayo, to those who might be investors of Zayo, by exposing them our financial trends in their raw form with a lot of data, they'll come back to us and say, this isn't really working, because look at this data here. So they help us make sure we're constantly focused on, are we building a sustainable cash flow model? So yeah, that's a fear, but I think our whole culture and environment is built around ensuring that we have a long-term sustainable cash flow generating business model. And I don't fear as much about others, because fiber in the ground is extraordinarily expensive. The opportunity to acquire enough fiber to make a difference, that chapter's already been written. That's not gonna, there's no opportunity for someone else to come along doing it. So we're down to really the last handfuls of companies who have vast fiber resources in the United States at their disposal. And I think there'll be more consolidation, but most of that consolidation has already occurred. So I think there's few enough suppliers in a big enough market that that's not a concern of mine.
Here. Hi, Purnima Voria, National U.S. India Chamber of Commerce. My question is very simple. Do you have plans to go to India? I know that you are in several countries already.
No, we don't have plans to go to India. Although we are starting to grapple with, and I'll underline the word grapple, with what a bandwidth solution, a global bandwidth solution business might look like. Because a lot of our customers have bandwidth needs around the globe, literally. I mean, there are companies who are all the big internet and content logos, and they need to have their content either reach or their users reach back. So they need to have these distributed networks where they need a solution, and they don't want to necessarily go cobble one together themselves. So we may look at how we might be able to play a role in providing more of a global bandwidth solutions for certain segments of our customers, which if we did that, it would certainly include India. But as far as having a deep fiber type strategy in an area like India, that's really not in the cards anytime in the foreseeable future.
Hi. What are some of the opportunities that you missed along the way that you kick yourself for that we could learn from?
Opportunities mixed along the way. I mean, it's, I think if I look back, part of entrepreneurship, part of being startups, part of eventually having success is dealing with a lot of things that you wish you could have over, but you just don't get over again. We are extraordinarily lucky. I'm extraordinarily lucky. The folks at Zayo are extraordinarily lucky to have had the chance of having do-overs. Frankly, we didn't deserve it. I mean, that whole mess of those exploding buildings, we were part of that, at least those of us who've been around for a while, yet for whatever set of reasons, we were given a do-over opportunity, and so far we've made pretty well with it. I think the biggest things that if I had the opportunity to turn back the clock, I look at and think about behavior that I was part of at certain points in time that frankly is embarrassing. Some of the things that we did during the big boom when money was flowing and everyone was trying to outdo one another, there were a lot of pretty embarrassing moments that you just wish you could have over again, because at the time it seemed like what you should be doing. And it's probably what happens right now in in some aspects of Silicon Valley with some of these overnight billionaires. They're probably learning some of those lessons as well, where you just let the exuberance of all of a sudden you're worth millions and tens of millions of dollars on paper, literally, even what would be 9-digit type money on paper. You start thinking that you're really something special, and you start behaving that way, and it's just not a very smart thing to do. So I would have more, if I had do-overs, it would be more how I handled myself during the big boom cycle itself, and then the meltdown.
Hi, TJ Johnson, MHO Networks. In delivering telecommunications today, the biggest problem in delivering fiber-based services tends to be those last mile kind of customer prem lit facilities issues. Given your perspective, do you foresee that those issues would be resolved, like a time frame to where lit fiber-based facilities to the customer prem would become commonplace?
So I definitely agree with the notion that one of the most difficult parts of delivering bandwidth is that getting into the buildings themselves and distributing around buildings, because buildings have landlords. And what's the favorite thing for landlords to do? Collect money. And when people are trying to deliver fiber to buildings, they want to get paid. And I don't see that changing. I see it's something that you chip away at slowly over time. But for a company like Zayo, we view that as probably a good thing, because a lot of what we have that's so unique is thousands of buildings directly attached to our fiber, thousands and thousands of buildings, and growing those buildings one at a time every month. And that unique infrastructure, the ability to get all the way into the customer location and distributing around is extraordinarily hard, tedious, and time-consuming to replicate. Part of what we're doing with our dark fiber business model, so we're about, as I said earlier, $1.1 billion in revenue. 40% of that revenue is either dark fiber or what we call mobile infrastructure, which is somewhat of a variant of dark fiber. And then if you add on to that our interconnect-focused colo, it's well into the 40%, maybe 45% of our revenue, and more than half of our EBITDA. So what we're doing with that dark fiber is we're solving problems like that by getting the fiber networks to break through these last miles, but then making that fiber available to many others so that they could leverage kind of that infrastructure that's in place. So I think that opens up opportunities for our customers to get their own bandwidth directly to their end users without having to replicate everything that we're doing.
One last one right here.
First of all, thank you for coming to speak to us today. I, for one, really appreciate that. But I was wondering, it seems like the first time in human history where anyone around the globe can theoretically instantly access the same stream of communication, and there's no central body that has any jurisdiction over all of it, and it seems like there's no practical way to regulate any of it, especially with these recent hackings like Target, I think Walmart. I mean, I guess my real question is, do you think you're playing with fire?
You know, I think the evolution of progress of humankind is playing with fiber. I mean, when the printing press was first developed, you had the Reformation, and you had every stage in history when there were massive developments. It shook up society in fundamental ways, over and over and over again, and we experienced that. The telecom experienced that multiple times. First with the telephone itself in the early 90s. Think early 1900s, late 1800s, when people started to be able to talk on phone. Think about how dramatically that changed society itself. The internet itself to date has dramatically changed society, but it's just getting started. As kind of applications develop and communication becomes much less centralized, data becomes much more prolific, it's going to change our society in ways we could barely imagine. So yeah, we're playing with fire. Damn right we are. But what are we going to? I think that's a good thing. That's what makes life interesting. Oh, I think I'm getting the hook. Well, thank you very much. Really. I appreciate the opportunity, and one thing you can count on from Zayo is we're going to be very supportive of the entrepreneurial environment, the economy of the Front Range. We take our role in that in a very serious way, and we look forward to working with more and more of you guys over time. Thanks.
We just want to thank Dan for his time tonight, and I hope you leave tonight with the knowledge that we have an excellent entrepreneurship curriculum here at Daniels. We also have a very heavy emphasis of entrepreneurship in our executive MBA program and have launched a number of very successful startup companies ranging from engineering services to restaurants to rock climbing businesses to medical devices that people have innovated as part of our program. So our curriculum has migrated over the last 5-7 years, and we've instilled, I think, an enthusiasm for entrepreneurship and the design thinking concepts in our students here. Tonight I wanted to thank our sponsors, U.S. Bank, Grant Thornton, Chase, First Bank, CoBank, Financial Executives International, the Daniels Executive and Professional MBA program, and our in-kind sponsors, the Denver Metro Chamber of Commerce, Net Impact, and the Mile High SHRM organization. We have 2 more Voices of Experience speakers to come yet this year as part of our series. On April 1st, Walter Bettinger, CEO of Charles Schwab, and on May 7th, Jim Lentz, CEO of Toyota North America. They'll be joining us, and we hope you do too. This evening, we've got a reception on the foyer, and there are people out there to talk to you if you are interested in any of our academic programs. So we hope that you will pick up some information, join them, and join us here at Daniels. Credits are available for these programs for continuing education in legal, professional, educational, and human resource credits. These qualify for those continuing education units. Thank you very much for coming tonight, and we hope to see you again. Bye.